Boom, there he is, right there on camera, and here's me. All right, hey, welcome everyone. We got author Paul Bruno here live in the mobile online studio. You know how we're doing it right now, everyone. Uh, Really cool thing going on tonight. All right, we got Paul Bruno, author of the original Jeeps, joining us live. If you got questions, drop them in the chat. We'll get them on, and we're just gonna jump right into this. Paul, welcome to the show. We're just having a good talk and good laugh and everything before that little bit of pregame. Why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about you, and we'll get into this book.
All right. Well, great to be on the show, Joshua, and just looking forward to a nice chat about what I call early Jeep history. My short version story is I grew up in upstate New York outside of Albany. Um, Went to school, went to college, yada, yada. After I graduated, I got in the information technology world, worked in that world for 25 years as we were kicking around before the show. And I finished my career as an information technology project manager. However, since I was a young person in elementary school, I've had a great interest and passion for history. So, one of the degrees I got later in life, in my 40s, I went back to school and got a master's in history. Then, after I retired at a relatively young age in 2012, and I'll get into the timeline of the books. I really focused on writing these books on early Jeep history, and we'll talk about the original Jeeps tonight, and I'll mention the other books. Over the last 12 years, I still dabble in project management a little bit and other things, but for tonight on your show from the mobile studio, we're going to talk about early Jeep history. So there you go.
Yeah,
That's
hey, let's do this because I always like to try to throw a shotgun out there. You got to own a Jeep, right, Paul? You own a Jeep, right?
Yeah, it comes up every
It's
interview
got to, right?
I
It's got
have.
to.
It comes up. It says, "Do you own a Jeep?" And the answer is, I don't actually.
No. Oh,
I'm
my.
not. I mean, I know it's going to be hard to believe, Joshua, looking at me, that I'm like a total dork, and I'm not an outside person at all. If I'm sitting in some dusty archive looking at historical papers, hey man, life is good. I mean, the chicks dig that. Let me tell you. Okay, that's totally not true, by the way. But first
Yeah.
lie for your audience. But so what I say is my contribution. I don't own a Jeep, but I'm not an outdoors guy or classic or otherwise. My contribution is to write about the early history of the Jeeps, and that's
Okay.
my strength. I'm an academic type person. I have 4 college degrees, which I think I forgot to mention. So it's like that's been my contribution, is digging into this early Jeep history in a way that no one has done in the entire history of the Jeep since 1940, which blows my mind, but that is the truth. So there you go. So we got that
Oh,
out of the way early. So good. Thanks
yeah.
for that.
No, no, not a
That's
problem.
scandal.
I
First
just, I just
scandal.
thought maybe like because the amount of detail and the technical things and besides the history, like there's a lot of technical history involved in it, right? Sure, you got nerded up in those areas, but I, there's got to be a passion for cars, vehicles. Is there anything like that or like what drew your attention to the Jeep?
Well, that's
The Jeep
a,
story.
that's a great question. I'll tell you exactly what drew my attention to it. My passion is history. I was starting to write screenplays back in 1999, something
Mm-hmm.
I got into, my wife and I, my late wife and I were doing, and I was looking for stories, but history stories, because history is my passion. And one day I was watching the History Channel, as like somebody said, back when they had history on it,
Mm-hmm.
1999, and they had a show, big rigs of combat, the Jeep. So I'm watching it. It's amazing I've lived as long as I am with that kind of lifestyle. The excitement never stops. The big rigs of combat Jeep. Again, women flock to me. Again, lie number two. So I'm watching it, and it says, before the commercial, it says the first Jeep was created by a bankrupt car company in Butler, Pennsylvania, in a miraculous time frame of 49 days in 1940. I'm like, what? I never heard of that. That
Mm-hmm.
was the hook. Literally the hook.
Okay.
20, 25 years later, I'm still talking about it. And the more I found out about the Jeep history, the more amazing it became. And we tried for 12 years to get the movie made about the creation of the first Jeep, and we couldn't do it. And in 2011, my wife and I, and she was a very academic person too, said we really probably should just write a book, just get the story out there.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, she passed away the next year, but that was the genesis of it. And we had just started the book research. And one of the things we knew we needed to do was to go to the National Archives and really dig into, if we are going to write a book,
Mm-hmm.
what happened. And that led me on an amazing journey, which we'll talk about in terms of finding out what truly happened and documenting the creation and development of the Jeep like no one has done before or up to now. I am it, which is kind of weird, but
Mm-hmm.
that's the passion, is the history, the people, what they did. So that's kind of was the genesis of my 25-year journey with the Jeep history,
So, so,
early
so
Jeep.
take us to that first. Again, you've said you've written several books, right? So, what, what was the first thing you learned about the Jeep besides that History Channel, right? That kept that was that first big. Yeah, I got to do this, not just one book, but I need to do this in several books because there's so much more that we need to cover that should be told about. Was that like one first thing that as you're digging through those archives, blowing the dust off those books?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, first I'll frame what I call early Jeep history for your listeners. That's my area of expertise. And what I mean by that, my area of expertise in books cover the creation and development of the Jeep in basically 1940 and 1941. Okay. And that's then once the war starts, that's not me. Okay. That's
Okay.
all the other books written about the Jeep. Now I have material in the books from the 1930s, the Genesis as the Jeep, that was Genesis material of how the Jeep came about. But really, what happened was that blew the whole thing open for me. When I went to the archives, I don't know if it was 213 or 214. I know I went 213 and found some stuff right after my wife passed away in 12. Um, and then I went back in 214. But in one of those two trips, I'd heard about, I don't even remember how I heard about it. Okay. But reading online or what my initial, trying to find out about more of what Bantam had done and da 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 about this court case that was prosecuted during the war called the Federal Trade Commission in the matter of Willis Overland Motors Inc. and the United States Advertising Corporation. What happened in 1943, Willis during the war was advertising that they had created the Jeep. And the Federal Trade Commission sued them for false advertising, saying that's not true. You didn't create the Jeep, it was done another way. Well, what happened was they had a complete and total trial on, to prove did Willis create the Jeep or not. But what it turned out being, which sat in the archives collecting dust for 70 plus years before I came along, well, 30 years at the Federal Trade Commission and 40 years at the archive, United States National Archives, 3,547 pages of testimony and 527 exhibits. The whole case is a complete documentation of how the Jeep was created and developed by the very
Oh.
people who did it. There was three companies involved: American Bantam Car Company, Willis Overland Motors Inc., and Ford Motor Company, and other people, and then people from the Army and other people. They deposed all of them and asked them, and this was 1944, 1945. So it was only a few years after all the events that most of them were all still alive, obviously still alive. There was a few people that were important that passed away.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and when they deposed them, they asked them, all the key people, what did you do? Why'd you do it? Where'd you do it? How'd you do it? And as I copied like 3,000 pages of this court case and started reading it, I started to realize this is a documentation of what happened that is unheard of in historical research, because basically it's a massive oral history.
Mm-hmm.
But most oral histories that you get are long after the events had happened, and the people are older, their memories may be bad, and also they may embellish things or,
Yeah.
not tell them. But these people, it was only a few years after the event, and they were in a court case, which means they had to tell the truth as they knew it under the possible penalty of perjury. And so this court case, once I started reasoning, and it dawned on me what I had here, I had an historical holy grail. All the people who were basically the key players from those three companies in the Army telling, and I'll give you examples from the court case of detail that has never come out, that's only in my books, because it was buried in that court case testimony that no one ever read until I came along in the last decade and read it all. And what happened was I had enough material. Then I'll finish this section off this way. I had enough material to create the first book, which was basically on the Bantam, and that goes through about October 1940. But then I realized from all my research there was two more segments of early Jeep history, basically from October 1940 to March of 1941, then March of 1941 to January 1942. And what I decided to do after the first book is that was a project management book specifically for that market. I rewrote all the material through October 1940 in historical vein and added in that second piece through March of 41. But then the pandemic hit. That was right around 2020,
Yeah.
and I put the book out there with 2/3 done. Well, last year I decided to finally said I got to finish out that last third. We finally did, and now with that, now the book going through all the way through January 1942 and documenting all that happened in the entirety of the procurement, creation, development, i.e., procurement of the Jeep. The original Jeeps now stands as the magnum opus, as I mentioned before the show started. One Amazon reviewer said no better account of the creation of the Jeep has been written, and it's the most historically accurate because the heart and soul of my book is the testimony from the court case, the
So
people telling things in their own words.
so what is through all your research, reading into that court case and everything, what's one of the biggest misconceptions that you like maybe that you had yourself or as you do these interviews that a lot of the Americans have of the Jeep that we're just oblivious to, right? Because I'd say like I always thought it was just it was the Jeep, right? Like it was, and you keep saying Willis. Is it Willis or is it Willys? Because I've always said Willys.
I was corrected by a major in the Army who said it was Willis, so I call it Willis.
You
A lot
okay?
of people
Yeah.
call it
So I
Willie,
mean,
but I call
uh,
it Willis.
yeah. I
That's
mean, that could be one of the misconceptions right there. But yeah, what's one of the biggest misconceptions you've kind of found that Americans have of the history of the Jeep, or anything like that that you found through all your research and everything?
good question. I wouldn't call it a misperception so much as for whatever reasons over time the Bantam story and the creation and development of the Jeep and the Ford story and the creation and development of the Jeep have been minimized. And
Okay.
Willis's role, which was important, has been kind of highlighted. Okay. Now, if you go out to Jeep.com and it's Jeep, it's their product, they can do whatever they want. But
Mm-hmm.
when they talk about the history of the Jeep, they barely mention Bantam, and they have a picture of the Willis Quad, the Willis MA, and the Willis MB out there, and they start Jeep history in 1941. So it's very Willis centric. So
Yeah.
the biggest thing I think that, if not a misperception, is that Willis did everything to create the Jeep and that they were very important. Okay. But Bantam was also very important. And Bantam has kind of gotten, historically kind of the short shift. And most
Mm-hmm.
people don't know the Bantam story. They know Willis, but
Yeah.
who's American Bantam Car Company? Who are these people? Never heard of them. So
Yeah.
that's part of I'm not a Bantam fan or a Willis fan or a Ford fan in terms of early Jeep history. I'm a fan of the history, and they all had an important role to play. But at least my books, they give the Bantam part of the story, which is a major part of the first part that up through October 1940. It gives them their due, and um, the people at Bantam that did an amazing thing, creating the first Jeep in 49 days, which was considered impossible. and delivering it with a half an hour to spare on the 49th day. Can't make that up. Right out of a movie. Oh yeah,
Yeah.
who wanted to do a movie on that? Oh yeah, that'd have been my wife and I. Um, so I think that's the biggest misconception is Bantam's story. They should, as the people who you never remember who did anything second, right?
Yeah.
Usually, right? It's always whoever did everything first. Well, there's always an exception, and in early Jeep history, Willis, who built the second Jeep, okay, the Willis Quad, they're the ones everybody remembers, and Bantam, who built the first Jeep, and miraculously, okay, and there's all sorts of stories behind it. No one even never really heard of them, and that's kind of sad. Not that, and that's not to degrade or diminish what Willis did. It's that they both should be in my viewpoint, from my research and writing, they should both get equal billing in terms of early Jeep history. Once the war starts and it's the Willis MB, yeah, it's all Willis all the time. That's perfectly fine. The Ford GPW. So hopefully
So
that
yeah,
answered your question.
no, that's great. And it leads us into the second part here, because you talked about your program management, program manager like background and stuff, and how one of your books actually covers that. So let's talk about the World War II starting. U.S. military puts out, hey, we need a mechanized, motorized vehicle of some sorts. And because World War I was one with horses and other things, right? Trench warfare, that kind of stuff. So, what was the background of that program manager? Why did we? And of course, anything. I got very small little bit of a contracting military experience. Things got to go out there for bid. But what was that fight between the three and the program manager that would lead us to, as you previously said, to a court battle to say, hey, yeah, we're calling it a Jeep, but who created it? Because I believe, and you could correct me, I guess it would be more modern, but like it was just called a Jeep. It wasn't Jeep as we know Jeep today, right? It wasn't Jeep that is a Jeep Wrangler, right? Back then it was like it's a Jeep, and it could have been a Ford Jeep, a Willys Jeep, right? Something like
Yeah,
that.
it's all true.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. You're definitely right on the right track in terms. Okay, what happened? Okay, so in the spring of 1940, in the 1930s, there was some research done and there was work being done to try to solve the problem of going right to your point. We need a mechanized vehicle that pretty much can do what the horse and a mule do, which
Mm-hmm.
is go anywhere and do anything, right? And they did some. I have background material in my book about things that were done in the 1930s before the official Jeep procurement started. Um, it's primarily in the infantry branch. Okay, what happened was the genesis or the catalyst for the Jeep procurement. Start, American Bantam was bankrupt, which is again what makes the story so amazing. All right, they'd hire a guy named Charles Harry Payne to go to Washington to try to get aviation contracts to put their plant to work because they weren't building any Bantam cars because no one was buying Bantam cars. They were bankrupt. And that whole Bantam story is covered in chapter 2 of the book. I found a lot. I was able to find what I could find. There's enough out there to tell Bantam's story. So
Mm-hmm.
anyway, so Harry Payne's wandering around from February to May in the War Department, back when it was the War Department,
Mm-hmm.
not the Defense Department, and so on and so forth. And in May night, and in the infantry now, simultaneously in the infantry branch, there was a guy named Ingemar Oseth, and he was a colonel in the infantry branch, and he was their vehicle expert. Well, there was a technical committee on vehicles that was run by the quartermaster, and in May 1940, they called a conference at a place called Camp Holeberg, Maryland. It was decommissioned, torn down in the 1970s. And they have a 3-day conference to discuss this issue of we need a vehicle between the motorcycle and the sidecar and a half-ton truck that can do almost anything. And what do we have? Well, at the end of that 3-day conference that Oseth was at, they go, we have nothing. We have nothing in
Oh.
existence. We have nothing on the drawing board. Okay. Oseth goes back to his office in the Washington, D.C. from Baltimore, and sitting in his window pane, in the window behind his desk, a little place there that someone could sit, is Charles Harry Payne from Bantam. He's looking for a guy named Robert Howie. He says to Oseth, I'm looking at a guy named Robert Howie because I want to talk about small vehicles for the Army. And Oseth says, that's me. I'm the infantry's guy for vehicles. So it's like miraculous. Okay.
Yeah.
These two meet and they cook up in 2 weeks a memo of here is the basic characteristics we would want in a small lightweight vehicle, and they called it the quarter ton truck 4x4 light. That was the official name of the Jeep before it was known as Jeep. Quarter ton truck 4x4 light, because it had to be 4x4, which was pretty new back in 1940.
Yeah.
So they cook up this memo, which comes out, which I actually have a copy of it in both my books, and it comes out on June 6, 1940. That's the date of the memo, okay? And that is literally 4 years to the day before D-Day, which is just unbelievable, okay? And so they list out 9 characteristics, and when I was doing my initial research on the quarter-ton truck 4x4 light, at the archives, I could not find anything before this June 6th memo. All right. I'm like, why isn't there anything about this before this memo? Well, when I read the trial, when I found the court case, that's when I realized it was that memo that started everything. Okay. So that's where the court case comes in. So let me just give you one example of detail from the court case that's nowhere else, that we would never have known unless they had deposed Ingemar Oseth, who wrote this memo, and he told this story. So when you read the memo, there's 9 characteristics. One of the characteristics is an armored face shield for the driver. And you're like, well, this is supposed to be a lightweight vehicle. Why would you have an armored face shield, which would be very heavy, for the driver? Yeah. Do you want to know why that was in there? Which, if you read this memo, you'd be like, why is that in? You would never know. In the court case, he testified that I put that characteristic in that memo as he called it a lawyer's trick, so that the procurement, now you're in the military, right? Sometimes people don't get along in organizations. So that the procurement for this vehicle would be directed to the ordnance department, because in those days, the ordnance department, if anything had armor, they procured it. Anything else, the quartermaster procurement. And they didn't want it to go to the quartermaster because the infantry was absolutely furious with the quartermaster for botching a procurement for a vehicle the year before. Okay. And there's testimony in terms of the whole thing, how they had botched a procurement for a vehicle called a Marmon Harrington in 1939. So Oseth put this characteristic in this, literally one of the most famous memos in history, because it was the jump start for the procurement of the Jeep, that we would never known that. Why is this armored face shield in there? That's the level of detail that's in my book, because I read all this testimony, and he testified right, and he called it, here you're in a courtroom with a whole bunch of lawyers, and he calls it a lawyer's trick, i.e., I'm doing something underhanded so that I could go to the ordnance department instead of the quartermaster, because I'm so ticked off at the quartermaster that, I don't want to go there. That is absolutely, in my opinion, priceless historical information from the very person who told the story. And I quote that when I did it, I took the material right out of the court case and put it in word for word in my book, so people can read him actually telling his own story, like, oh, I put that in there as a lawyer's trick because I didn't want the procurement to go to the quartermaster. I wanted to go to ordnance department. That's the level of detail. Number one. I'll give other examples as we talk along.
I think that's very slick, because I'd imagine that would also, if that's not a quartermaster procurement, then that's artillery, then that's artillery funding too, right? So there's all kinds of things, as you're very well, like program managing and stuff, like tricks like that, where you could, like, if we add these things, it has to push through this way, and then we could get their support or their funding to kind of move it where we want to. So I think that's very, very cool. So how did we go from, if it's Bantam that helps him write this memo, right, to Ford and Willis participating in it? Is that just natural, they had to contract it out and give more people opportunities?
No. there, there is so much political drama in the creation of the Jeep. It's amazing. So I'll give you the short time frame, okay? So they write this memo, they get support for it, and it goes to the ordnance department. And the ordnance department has a meeting, and they look around at each other, and this has never happened in meetings in all of history. And they said, we have no clue how to procure a vehicle, because that's what the quartermaster does.
Mm-hmm.
So why don't we go to the Bantam factory, since Harry Payne was involved, and the Bantam was the only true small car builder at the time that had expertise in small cars. Why don't we go visit the Bantam factory and see if we can figure out what the heck we're doing here? Because the ordnance department's like, we don't have a clue. We don't procure vehicles. We blow stuff up. That's what ordnance does. We blow stuff up. We don't build stuff. So they go to Bantam's factory. Now, here's another never known. So they go to Bantam's factory for 2 days and they get a basic idea of what they want. During that, when I was doing my research, I'll try to see if I can put it up here. I didn't find it real quick. They did a drawing, okay? You can see that drawing, okay? All right, can you see it?
Yeah, we got it. Yep.
All right. That drawing was floating around on the internet for years, okay? And people would say, we believe this is a drawing that's the first drawing of what would be a Jeep, but we don't know who did it, where they did it, and why they did it. I'm reading the trial testimony, Joshua, page 1457 or so. And a guy named Frank Fenn, who was the president of the Bantam, he described in detail what they did in those 2 days of June 19th and June 20th, 1940. And in his testimony, he said, at the end of the first day, Mr. Brown and Mr. Beasley took a yellow scratch pad indicating. So in the courtroom, he's pointing to a yellow scratch pad, and they drew a drawing. They created a drawing of what they thought this vehicle would be like and look like. That's that drawing. Okay. And there's actually a copy of it in the court case. I'm holding the a copy of from the 1940s of the first drawing of a Jeep in my hands. Okay. It's like the feeling of that is the level of the weight of history, right? But the point is, in my book, for the first time in Jeep history, we knew who drew that drawing, where they drew it, why they drew it, and the context of why they drew it. That's the level of detail in my book. That's nowhere else. Everywhere else, like, we don't know who drew this drawing. I'm like, why did I find that out? Why? Because I read this testimony that no one's read for 70 years.
Yeah.
So they go to Bantam. They go back real quick. They go back. They have a meeting at the ordnance department. They go, yeah, we're not going to have an armored face shield in this quarter-ton 4x4 truck light. So it's going to go, guess who? To the quartermaster, which the infantry didn't want to go to. All right. So within 3 weeks, they create, it's like a warp speed, okay? You're in the military. Sometimes things don't move quickly, okay? I've been in government bureaucracy. They don't move quickly, right? In 3 weeks, they created a specification and a drawing from June 20th, 1940 to July 2nd, 1940, a specification, 17 pages, ES 475, and a concept drawing 08370-Z that a manufacturer could build a vehicle to. 3 weeks. Okay. They go out and they decide to do a bid. Okay. And there's a whole bunch of machinations around that. But to get to your question, Bantam wins that bid. A whole bunch of drama around that. Mm-hmm. Once Bantam won that bid, that was for 70 vehicles. Bantam's going to go off and build their pilot model, and they're supposed to build it in 49 days, which is considered impossible. Okay. The quartermaster, literally the next day after they awarded the bid to Bantam, they had a meeting with Willis and said, well, if you guys want to build a pilot model on your own money and on your own time and, and deliver it to us, we'll take a look at it. So here it is. They're basically creating a side project with Willis to keep them going. They had lost the bid instead of just waiting to see what Bantam came up with. That's how Willis got involved, stayed in the procurement after the bid. So now, they finished it. How Ford got involved was Ford didn't bid. This is July 1940. They didn't bid on the original 70. Okay. In October 1940, after Willis was already building their prototype, Bantam had built their prototype and delivered it in September. In early October, the quartermaster themselves called up Ford and asked them to build the vehicle and gave them all the documentation of everything that had been learned from July to early October. And Ford then built the vehicle, but they had a big head start because they basically were able to work from what Bantam had done and all the lessons learned, and they delivered a vehicle in November. That's how you ended up with Bantam, Willis, and Ford in this procurement all together by October 1940. So
So
there you
so
go.
we got Bantam delivering 70, but this is all still like for trial and error, right? Like this, hey, deliver your first one so we could do some testing and evaluating, right? We're still at that point, right?
Right. What happened was Bantam delivers. So basically, that whole procurement for 70, that was all seat of the pants. Quartermaster had no clue. They're like, well, all right, we'll go for 70. The chief of staff got involved. They scratched together $175,000, which was trying to find money in 1940 with the depression still.
Yeah.
They weren't gearing up. And I'm going to, give an example of how things changed in a year here, money wise. So, and they only wanted 70. So they get to where Bantam has delivered their prototype, and it's early October 1940, and Willis is working on theirs, and Ford's going to work on theirs. And they looked around and said, "Well, now what do we do?" They had no plan. It's like, so they had a bunch of meetings, and they said, "Well, why don't we give a 500 vehicle contract to Bantam to build some more that we could test?" Okay, because they've had a
Oh,
pilot and passed their test.
yeah.
Well, Ford and Willis objected to that. So they had more meetings and they said, this is in October, November, December 1940. Well, why don't we give everybody a 500 vehicle contract? Well, other people objected to that because, well, Willis and Ford don't have approved prototypes. You're supposed to have approved prototype before you get a
Mm-hmm.
contract. So then somebody said, well, if we're going to build 1,500, why don't we give a 1,500 contract to Bantam? Well, that sounded good to some people, but Willis and Ford, you know, disagreed again, protested again, right? So it's only taxpayer money, by the way. So then they all said, well, you know what? Why don't we give a 1,500 contract to all three of them? We'll give 1,500 to Bantam, 1,500 to Willis, and 1,500 Ford, even though Ford and Willis don't have approved prototypes, which was basically going against their own rules. And
Yeah.
through a whole bunch of massive, high-level political machinations, by December 1940, all three had contracts to build 1,500 experimental vehicles. So that could be tested in 1941 to continue the evolution of the Jeep. So, and they were all known as quarter ton 4x4 lights, and by fall 1940, and they would either ask for the Ford or the Bantam or the Willis and the Jeep name, which we don't really know how it all came about, started to be applied to the quarter tons. It was actually a generic term that they would use for a lot of vehicles, but it got
Right.
explicitly put into the quarter ton, and then eventually only to the quarter ton during the fall of 1940 and the early winter of 1941. By about February 1941, the quarter ton 4x4 light was basically known as the Jeep. So that's where we stood by early by December 1940. You've got three companies. Bantam's off building their 1,500 because they have an approved prototype, and Willis and Ford are waiting to see if their prototypes are approved.
So these
Next question.
1,500, or rather 4,500, between all three, right? They're actively like in Europe being utilized yet
No.
by other forces, or they're still just being tested here, American stateside? Because, like, I know we didn't technically join until 41 after Pearl Harbor and everything, but we still had plenty of pilots over there flying with the Royal Air Force, things like that. So are they just here stateside, still just being tested?
Yeah, it's a good question. So Bantam was able to build their 1,500 by, say, March, April 1941. They were tested stateside. Willis, now they've already almost fell out of this whole procurement in July 1940 when we talked about that. They were put back in by the quartermaster. Well, Ford's prototype passed its testing, so they were able to,
Okay.
all right, your prototype is good, go build 1,500. Okay. And the Bantam car was known as the Bantam Reconnaissance Car. That's what Bantam named their car. Ford had named their vehicle the Pygmy. They changed the name for the 1500 to the Ford GP, G for government, P for a wheelbase of 80 inches. Willis's initial vehicle was called the Quad, I think because of the 4x4.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Quad failed the testing. And in January
Mm,
1941, there was a whole bunch of arguments about how Willis is going out of this procurement because they don't have an approved vehicle. Well,
mm-hmm.
through a whole other bunch of political machinations, they were reinstated by the top officials at the Army, the deputy chief of staff, into the procurement, even though they didn't have an approved prototype. Okay. They basically
Okay.
said, okay, your prototype has failed, but guess what? We're now going to say it's passed, even though it hadn't
Sounds like some
passed.
insider trading or something going
Oh,
on
it
there.
was unbelievable. I have all the memos, it's all in the book. Okay. So, but Willis, to their credit, they went back to the drawing board. Now, Willis's biggest issue was the weight. That was a problem with the whole procurement. It's documented in my book. The Army's initial weight requirement was completely, utterly impossible to meet. And all three vendors had trouble meeting it. Finally, by February 1941, they settled on 2,160 pounds, which I'm not a math genius, but that's half a ton. They still called it the quarter ton, though. And they'd
Yeah.
come up with the quarter ton weight without asking anybody that the Army had, without asking anyone what it should weigh. They said, well, it's going to replace this motorcycle sidecar that weighs 500 pounds and a half ton truck, which weighs 2,000 pounds. Therefore, it's got to weigh 1,250 or 1,300 pounds. Well, they never asked anybody who was going to build one. You couldn't build one of these vehicles with what they wanted,
Yeah.
at least 1,800 pounds. Anyway, so Willis was massively overweight. The reason they were overweight is they had gone with a 60 horsepower engine as opposed to a 40 horsepower engine that Ford and Bantam had put in their prototypes to try to keep the weight down. Well, once they upped the weight requirement, Willis went back
Mm,
to the drawing board, and I mean, through meticulous engineering, got their weight down to 2,159 and 3/4 pounds, but they had a 60 horsepower engine. Now, when they did this redesign, it was so different from the Quad. They decided we're going to come up with a new nomenclature. Well, it's our military vehicle, and it's the first version, so we're going to call it the A. So that's how you got the Willis MA. Very
mm,
complex naming here we're going into, right? The Willis
yeah.
MA, the military vehicle, is the first version, so it will be called the MA. Well, the Willis MA was one heck of a Jeep. And with that extra 20 horsepower, it was the best of all three of those Jeeps were really, really good. Okay. It was the best, but Willis MA was the best of the bunch. So they built their 1500, and yes, they basically tested them stateside. Now because Bantam had started earlier, the quartermaster put in an extra 1,000 order to Bantam that did go to Lend Lease, that did go overseas. To answer your question, but
Okay.
most of the 1500, what they called the experimental models, which was
Yeah.
the BRC Bantam Reconnaissance Car 40, the Willis MA, and the Ford GP, they were tested stateside. And I have a whole chapter on the testing that gives the flavor of how detailed they tested. I have detailed test reports in my research, da 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 da. But 1941, so by March of 41 through the end of 1941, they were testing the vehicles around the United States in a nationwide test, all sorts of conditions, all sorts of terrain, all sorts of climate, so on and so forth.
So
Well,
you got into the engineering there, right? About the horsepower, but how did Willis change or upgrade or fix that four wheel drive problem? Because I'd imagine, like, besides the weight requirement that was changed, like their biggest number one factor had to be or requirement a four wheel drive system, right? If we're supposed to go everywhere where horses go and this and that, and horses aren't four wheel drive, but I mean four legs that move independently of each other, they could get up and down some things, right? So what did Willis do to change that? Because I think that would have been the biggest hurdle. It's the weight change and having 20 more extra horsepower. Horsepower is always king, but what happened with that four wheel drive system that made it better than the others, or was it not that at all? And it came down to that more horsepower.
4x4, another thread in the Jeep story. Okay, there's so many threads that are in my book
Yeah.
that I can't cover them in an hour. Here's what happened with that. Willis didn't do anything to create 4x4. And you say, well, Paul, who did? Joshua, thanks for asking. Just hang out, have a little conversation by myself, okay? What happened was back in July 1940, when they were developing the specifications for the Jeep and it's coming out, they knew the 4x4 was going to be the front axle, especially, was going to be the key to be able to create a 4x4 vehicle. It was
Hmm.
fairly new technology. Well, what did they do? They went to the premier axle manufacturer in the country with 4x4 called Spicer Axle.
Yeah.
And they
Okay.
said, the government is procuring a new vehicle. It's going to need 4x4. Here's what it's looking like. Can you do something? Well, guess what? In the court case that keeps on giving, they deposed the two main engineers who developed the axles for the original Jeeps, Fred Lewis and Robert Hall. Hopefully, I have those names right. Okay. The two engineers who created the axles for all Jeeps from time immemorial, right? And they went into detail of how they created an axle for Bantam. Okay. And when Bantam was building their vehicle in 49 days, that was the key thing. Would the axle be delivered in time? It was
Yeah.
literally delivered like 5 days before they put the whole vehicle together. Spicer came through. Spicer also worked, and now Spicer was based in Toledo along with Willis. They were like within 2 or 3 miles of each other in Toledo. Bantam was in Butler, which is 30 miles northeast of Pittsburgh. So close by, but not
Hmm.
like Spicer and Willis. And they'd all worked together because Spicer was the premier, axle manufacturer in the country at the time. They worked with Willis to create a four-wheel axle for their Willis quad. Then eventually they also worked with Ford to create a four-wheel drive axle for the Pygmy, their original prototypes. Well, when the 4500 order came along, they all got their axles from Spicer.
Okay.
So,
So
but my book is the only one that goes into the absolute detail of how the original 4x4 was created by Spicer Axle. They modified a Studebaker axle in detail, nowhere else, because when they went to Toledo with the court case, they deposed the two guys who had developed the axle. How good is that? It's
that's
unbelievable.
yeah. That's
Unbelievable deep.
and Spicer axles are still very popular today.
There
Dana
you go.
Dana axles are as well. I'm a bit of an off road guy. Don't own a Jeep, but so that makes two of us here today, Paul. No biggie there. But yeah. So I mean, still like a very well known axle company going back, 60, 70, 80 years now or so, right? Um, so then that being said, then it came down to them making that choice of the larger engine, right?
Yeah,
Like if everything else being equal, most part, the weight mostly equal, axles and four wheel drive system looks like it was cookie cutter on the bottom, through the drivetrain area. It was that extra 20 horsepower.
right, and that's the differentiator. And in my book, I have the testimony of Delmar Ruse, the vice president of engineering for Willis, and he went into detail of why they chose that engine and how they develop it. I actually have detail in the book of Delmar Ruse describing testing and development they did on the Go Devil engine, which was the engine that was in every single Jeep that was produced for World War II. My book is the only one that has the detail on the Go Devil engine, the
That's a pretty cool
RPMs, the
name.
testing did it because Delmar Ruse wanted to testify in terms of and they basically, now here's the real creep, right? We talked about January 41, they were going out. Well, the Army basically told them, you need to cut the weight and you need to put in a different engine. And Willis went back and said, and Delmar Ruse testified and said, we had a number of meetings and they were probably pretty heated. And they eventually said, we are going to plant our flag on this engine because Delmar Ruse believed, correctly, by the way, the guy was a
Yeah.
prophet, that more power in a military vehicle is never wasted. And if
Yeah.
he hadn't made that decision, one guy, the Jeep that was created for the war, it would not have been the Jeep. It still would have been a good Jeep, but that extra 20 horsepower allowed the Jeep to do a lot more when the war came than it would have if it only been 40 horsepower. So you want to
Yeah.
hear that how they finally got to the Willis MB?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So here we are. We got 4,500 experimental models, three vendors. In late June 1941, orders came down from the top of the Army, without boring with all the extra detail, We want 16,000 of these vehicles and we want them now. All right. They're not even done with the testing, and the MA didn't even come out to May, right? And in the testing, the MA proved really a superior Jeep. I just huge pat on the back to the Willis people for the MA. So they go out, and so the Army was the quartermaster, which was kind of Ford biased. Not that's ever happened in any organization. They wanted to give the contract to Ford for the 16,000, which means the GP would have been the vehicle for the war. And one guy, they had to go for approval. One guy named William Knutson said, no, you're going to do a bid. We have 3 vendors. You're going to do a bid. Quartermaster, not happy again. So the quartermaster puts a bid out, right? Willis, Bantam, and Ford all bid. One other person bid, right? Willis has the low price and arguably the best vehicle, right? The quartermaster writes a 10-page technical analysis on the bids. This is the short version, Joshua. You ready? Ford walks on water and Bantam and Willis stink. 4-page memo to sum that up. And we want to award the 16,000 contract to Ford. Okay. And I put the whole memo. I have the actual copy of the memo here right in my office, right on my computer, copied it at the archives. I put it in the book because it's important. It's a very important historical document to see.
Yeah.
This was supposed to go to the Ford GP. It went back to the William Knutson's department where they had to get approval from, and William Knutson said no. Willis has the lowest price, and we're not going to spend an extra $1 million on this. And he probably didn't say it, but the best vehicle, quartermaster, you're going to award this 16,000 contract to Willis. So that was the 3rd time Willis came back literally from the dead. All right, July 1940. January 1941 and July 1941, they come back from the dead. The quartermaster gets that directive from Knutson. Ooh, they were not happy. I have a memo that they wrote to get the approval. It was basically like, you told us we had to do this. It was like little kids. You told us we had to do this. So here's your memo to say we've got to give this to Willis. So that's how Willis got the contract for 16,000. Now think about the numbers. In 1 year, they went from we want 70 to 16,000. And we only have $175,000, that 16,000 contract was $12 million. 1940 money. That's real money. $12 million.
Yeah.
That's a lot of money now. So here's what. So after the Willis got the contract, the Army wanted a whole bunch of more changes to the MA from all the testing that had been done between the BRC 40, the MA, and the GP. And they made so many changes. Willis said, well, this is a lot different from the MA. So it's still a military vehicle. And technically now it's the 2nd version. So we'll call it the B. So that's how I got the name Willis MB. Iconic name. That's how I got the Willis MB. So to finish the story real quick, Joshua, then we can just, wrap up, chit chat how we want. So then literally within a month, the Army's like, it's like Jaws. We're going to need a bigger boat. They're like, we're going to need a lot more of these than 16,000. So they went to Willis and said, they did the Godfather. Willis
made him a deal he can't refuse. We're going to make
an offer you can't refuse. So because they basically asked them, what would it take for us to be able to have someone else build your vehicle under license? And Willis wrote, they asked that October 3rd, 1941. Willis wrote a letter, 2-page letter, which I actually put the whole letter in my book. Here's what we need if someone's going to build this to license our vehicle. This is what we'd have to do, okay? Quartermaster got a hold of that. In 3 weeks, they had awarded another 15,000 contract to Ford to build the Willis vehicle under license. 3 weeks. It took them to January 42 to actually get the final approvals. 3 weeks. So by late October, early November 41, just before the United States entered the war, you've got Willis building 16,000, and Ford is going to build the Willis vehicle under license. And so what they decided to do is, well, our vehicle is called the GP, government, G for government, P for 80-inch wheelbase. This is the Willis vehicle, so we're going to call it the GPW, GP Willis. That's how you got the Ford GPW name. And those were the two that were built for the war. Bantam was in the game of musical chairs, was the odd person out. They didn't get any more contracts. They went to Willis and went to Ford, and Willis wouldn't even got the contract for the MB if it hadn't been for one guy, one person can make a big difference in history.
Mm-hmm.
William Newton saying no. And thank God he did, because having that 60 horsepower engine that Delmar Roos wanted, that engine went into every GPW too. So that's kind of the
What?
overview of how this all happened. There's a lot more
Yeah.
detail in my books in terms of, especially the original Jeeps, all the machinations that went on. It's a melodrama. I always say this, like I say at least once in an interview, you can't make this stuff up. You
Yeah.
literally can't make it up. It's unbelievable. Go ahead.
What do you think? This is more opinion, right? And if the Jeep didn't come alive, if it didn't come to fruition, if it wasn't, all these things, especially with the Willis, right? What if Willis did change it back to a 40 horsepower engine? What if they did not win the bid? If they didn't get the axles, what if it would have just been Bantam with whatever Bantam had, right? What if the Jeep didn't exist in any of the three variations? Where do you think we would have ended up? Or let's not even say Jeep. Let's take it back to the quarter ton 4x4 pickup light.
Right,
Where
exactly.
would we have been?
That's a really good question, and I can actually answer that from one of the people who actually was involved. Remember Ingemar Oseth from the infantry?
Mm-hmm.
What he testified was, this is how the Jeep procurement started, but the need for the vehicle, and this is how he eventually got from nothing to the Willis MB, okay, that they documented in the court case, and I've documented besides the court case, other stuff. But he said the need for the vehicle was so great, they probably would have gotten there some other way.
Mm-hmm.
We just don't know what way it would have been. So they probably would have got there, but they got there through this whole series of miraculous occurrences that literally you can't make them up, starting right almost from the beginning, with Oseth meeting Payne and his sitting in his office window, through the going to ordnance to the there's more detail around how Bantam won the bid. They basically lied. They lied on the weight, and they lied and said they could make the weight, and they said, oh yeah, we could build it in 49 days. They had no idea if they could build it in 49 days. They, nice ethical question to
Yeah.
talk about in a procurement class. But yeah, they would have gotten there some other way. And yeah, and your question is so important, because the vehicles is credited as a minimum one of the top 5 reasons why the Allies won the war. They
Mm-hmm.
had the most mobile vehicle that could go anywhere and do anything. Now, one thing again, detail that is nowhere else in the world. Okay, one of the guys from Willis testified that here, later in the trial, here is the 38 major changes we've made to the MB since it started production. So these 38 changes, which he went into detail on what the change was and when it went into production, like number 25,000 of the Willis MB, number 140,000. It shows the evolution of the vehicle during the war to what the MB
Mm-hmm.
eventually came from to by 1945, excuse me, and how the vehicle went from the original MB, which was really good, to a vehicle that could go anywhere, do anything, perform in any climate, from sub-zero temperatures to tropical heat of 90 degrees and 100% humidity. So that's detail. That 38 changes, which was 10 pages of testimony, that's nowhere else but in Paul Bruno's The Original Jeeps. It's been sitting in the archives, buried in, that was page 1091 to 1101 of the testimony. No one ever read it. It's like, I'm reading this going, this is unbelievable. This is really important information to have. So here's the 38 major changes there was 250 or so changes, but most of them were minor.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the guys who actually built the original 3 Willis Jeeps, a guy named, I think it was Henry McCaslin that did that testimony. Or it was Donald Stone. I don't remember off the top of my head. I think it was McCaslin. But he was one of the 4 people that built all 3 of Willis's early Jeeps. He testified, who could be a better expert to say, here is how the MB evolved during the war. No one else has that information, but The Original Jeeps by Paul R. Bruno.
That's you.
There you go.
Yeah. Paul, I don't have a heart out, but if you do, let me know, because I mean I could just keep going. Another question, and you let me know if we need to wrap up. I think you gave it a lot of credit there, right? Top 5 reason contributing to the success in World War II. the amount of logistics, me being a logistics specialist here in the Navy, right?
Yeah.
And loving the old saying that, I'm going to paraphrase and butcher it, but rookies talk strategy and professionals talk logistics, right? Um, it contributed so much to that, right? We didn't have to use mules and horses and moving artillery and this and that, and that speaks to a lot of those changes and how versatile the Jeep was for World War II. Like, oh hey, you know what? We needed to do this. All right, cool, quick change, and boom, they're on the battlefield, and they're tow vehicles. They're this, they're that. There's a lot of things there. Where do you? And this might be getting out of some of your expertise here, the early history stuff, but how did it, or again, maybe it's out of your expertise. Where did we transition from awesome World War II vehicle to we're bringing this home, and we're gonna get this back home as our everyday, daily driver kind of thing? Have you read any of that? Is there any interest in that to you?
That's beyond my scope of what I've researched. I can answer the question, but that's beyond my scope of where
Yeah.
my research, my books, because my research are early Jeep history,
Right.
through January 1942. But basically, what happened toward the end of the war, Willis wanted to make Jeeps for the civilian market. Ford
Mm-hmm.
didn't care. Ford stopped producing Jeeps in early 1945 as they could see that the war was starting to wind down.
Okay.
And it was really Willis who carried the Jeep on after the war into the civilian market. And there's people have written books on that and that documentation. I think what is the most amazing thing, and we kind of did a tribute to the Jeep in chapters 13 and 14, starting in 1941 through photographs and the original Jeeps, where we show the Jeep being used in all theaters of the war in all branches of the services. It was used in the Air Force, it was used in the Navy, it was used by the Army, it was used by the Marines on Guadalcanal, for example, and that's
Mm-hmm.
how versatile it was. And there's pictures of it driving around in minus 10-degree weather at Bastogne, and then on Iwo Jima. Okay,
Yeah.
it just was an amazing vehicle in terms of what it could go anywhere and do anything. And again, after the war, that's a whole nother story in terms of where Jeep has gone from 1945 to now. But it really was Willis Overland that, they built the Jeeps after the war. Willis eventually was absorbed by Kaiser in the 50s, and it was Kaiser Willis. And then finally, in the early 60s, the whole Willis name, which John North Willis built one of the biggest car companies ever during the 1910s and 1920s, and even through the 30s and 40s. By 1963, Kaiser dropped the Willis name, and the Willis name went into went into the dustbin of history, and it was known as the Kaiser Jeep. Then Jeep was bought by an American Motors Corporation, and one of the interesting stories of the Jeep after the war is almost every 10 years, like clockwork, the Jeep has been sold to a different owner.
Mm.
And it's like, don't know why. It's got like
It just keeps
this
moving.
like
Yeah.
this I don't want to call it checkered history since the war, because it's been a great vehicle, but it's just like somebody buys it 10 years later, it's somebody else is owning it. So, but it's still here, and that's what really the testimony of the people that when I go into the detail, like I have concept drawing 08370-Z, the drawing they sent out to the 135 manufacturers to build the first Jeep. It's an amazing drawing, okay? Every Jeep, every build can trace its lineage back to that drawing. That's the great importance of my books, is this is where it came about. These are the documents that created the Jeep. And these are the people who did it. And this is their testimony telling what they did, when they did it, how they did it, where they did it, how it all interconnects. And that's what I did, is all the testimony, 3,500 plus pages, it's all over the place. My job was to organize in a coherent narrative and place everything in its proper place in terms of when it happened, what they're testifying to. Okay. Because they would be testifying in 1940, then the lawyer would ask the person a question about 1941 and this and that. And that's been my contribution. Like I said, no book out there in early Jeep history, and it has the historical accuracy because the court case, which I consider the holy grail of early Jeep history,
Yeah.
all right, is there. Now, I'll give you one other story real quick. History as it's happening. Don't know if it's ever going to happen. When I was going through the court case, there was exhibits that were missing, which is not supposed to happen in archived materials.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what are these exhibits that are not here in these exhibit boxes? The exhibit boxes hold 8.5 by 11-inch paper. Well, when I went home and read the testimony, they were blueprints of the quad, the MA, the MB, and the blueprint they built the first Jeep from. They're
Wow.
missing. And I asked when I went back in 2016, I was there in 2014, 2 years later, I realized what they were. I asked people at the archives and they could not give me an answer. And I basically let it sit since from then till I finished the book. But I'm getting older now, and I said, I got to take one more crack at trying to see if I can get the National Archives to find out what happened to these blueprints. They're historic. They're
Yeah.
priceless. You've
Yeah.
got the blueprints they built the original Jeeps from, that every single Jeep, millions of them were produced from these blueprints. And I'm working on that right now as we speak. I don't know if I'm going to be successful, but I haven't given up in terms of trying to get the National Archives, because what I think happened was these blueprints were oversized. They were big. So they stored them in different boxes than the boxes that they have at these smaller boxes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, what happened to those boxes? They're not
Someone
with
threw them
it.
up on a shelf somewhere.
Well, I'm hoping. My joke is
Mm-hmm.
it's right next to the Ark of the Covenant in that big warehouse at the end of the first Indiana Jones movie. So
Yeah.
I think we can wrap up if you want, in terms of just wind it down here, because we've been
Y-
going for about an hour, and that's a good amount of time.
Yeah. Let me just ask you one more, and you don't have to give away spoilers, because I'm a car guy, truck guy, engines, motors. Like I love things that go vroom, right? Whether it's a Jeep, a truck, a car. A lot of those old cars I really like. Wish to own one day. Um, where? Well, I had it and I lost it. My goodness. Sorry, Paul.
You didn't
I
want me to
had it
give
right
any
there.
spoilers.
No. Oh, no.
Spoilers.
Okay. That's no. Yeah. No spoiler alerts. Your movie, right? I love watching. Like, so. Did you see the the Ford versus Ferrari movie with
Yeah,
all the big names in that? You saw that one?
Matt Damon. Yep, yep.
Yeah. Okay. So, what does your Jeep movie look like? Does it revolve around the court case? Because it seems that's what you're most passionate about, is this court case and how the court case really tells the history. So is that what your movie revolves around? Again, no spoilers. I don't want no one stealing Paul's idea. All right, beat it, nerds. But like, where do you see you setting this movie about the Jeep history in?
Oh, that's great. Great question. Oh, no spoiler alerts. Our movie focuses on the Bantam, creation of the first one.
Okay,
And we wrote the screenplay, which we have. Okay,
yeah,
we
gotta keep
wrote the
shopping it.
screenplay. Well, I wrote a whole bunch of screenplays over time from 1999 to 2016, and the first versions were more dramatizations. I had to
Mm-hmm.
make a bunch of stuff up. But once I had the court case, my passion,
Okay, yeah.
we rewrote the screenplay to be very accurate to the history. So our current screenplay basically tells the story of the creation of the first Jeep. Okay. And it stays focused to that because that's what you want to stay focused on in 2 hours. These people at American Bantam, a bank, I mean, the ultimate underdog story. We call it
Mm-hmm.
Rocky meets Tucker. I don't know if you remember that. Tucker, the man in his machine, but back in the 80s or 90s, he came up with that. Rocky meets Tucker, where you have the ultimate underdog overcoming every possible obstacle to deliver this vehicle on the 49th day with a half an hour to spare, which changed the course of history. That's our screenplay. Now, since we're talking about that, we got a few minutes. I'll just say I've approached the Jeep division numerous times on this movie. Excuse me, because I believe, excuse me, that it's the greatest marketing vehicle ever. Okay, you're literally going to create a movie which tells the story about the creation of your vehicle, your product, a
Mm-hmm.
2 hour infomercial that people would go pay to see.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, if anyone out there is listening, to whatever reasons, the Jeep division is very, I talked about this before the show, they're very Willis centric. They
Yeah.
don't really they don't really recognize Bantam's contribution in early Jeep history. Now, for whatever reason, it's fine. It's their product. They can do
Yeah.
that. So, but if it was me, they spend millions and millions of dollars on advertising, and you could create this movie that basically is a complete commercial for your product. I've always seen it as a marketing
Yeah.
vehicle that you'd invest $20 million, whatever, and you'd have this movie forever that would play around the world that people would go pay to watch your
Mm-hmm.
commercial. Who pays to go watch a commercial?
Yeah.
You have, but I can't get the Jeep division to see that, and they don't seem to want to recognize the Bantam. And I mean, I could rewrite the screenplay to focus on Willis, but it wouldn't be the same.
Yeah.
So that's been, I've tried for 20 plus years to interest the Jeep division. So if anybody knows anybody at the Jeep division that's listening, want to try this movie again, if they would ever at least consider recognizing Bantam's contribution, they have one of the greatest, most unique marketing opportunities in history to create a movie about their product. And basically, Ford versus Ferrari was a very similar
Yeah.
idea than this movie is, but different story. And when I saw that, and that movie made like $200 million,
Mm-hmm. It was a very good
I
movie.
can't, and I can't get them to do it. I just can't get them. And that
Yeah.
goes to the ultimate reason why we had this ultimate conclusion of this interview, and that is the reason I can't get them to do it is because I'm a complete nobody. Thanks for coming and watching Joshua's show. There you go. Paul Bruno was a nobody. Well, glad I went an
uh,
hour to figure that one out. Jeez.
no, Paul, I appreciate it. Again, I look forward. And I hope you keep trying because me being a big movie fan too, I think that'd be great, right? Anytime you set stuff in the courts, I think you have a great opportunity for very big name actors to play some of these major roles. Even if this is like one of those Ryan Nolan films that has all the big names, even if it's for just a small little 15-minute role in it, right? You got to get the big name actor to play that Oseth, I think that Oseth, I think you
Yeah,
said their
oh,
name
that's
was,
her
right?
name.
You
Yeah,
got to have,
yeah.
yeah, you got to have a big key player to do that. So don't give up, keep trying. I think it'd be great. And again, also do the marketing, right? Like Jeep has a huge following. The Eastern Jeep Safari, the Western Jeep Safari, Jeep everywhere, right? It's mostly why I will never buy one. The ducks on a Jeep, it's there. It's just so much like it's annoying to me
Yeah.
by this point. But it won't hurt their brand at all to support something like that. Give some credit to the first originator, and then just say, yeah, this was the story of it. This is how it came about. And in the end, Willie's, whatever they want to call it won out because of this story and just how it played out. There is no foul play there, really. So I think they could definitely do it. Paul, why don't you let us know one more time your book, where we could get it, and all your socials and anything else you got?
And I'll make one more point to that, and then I'll answer that
Yep.
question. And you're absolutely right. Recognizing Bantam would not diminish what Willis has done. There's
Mm-hmm.
room for both. And I just
Absolutely.
hope someday I'll live long enough. I'm starting to wonder, getting old, if that happens. My books are all on Amazon. The original Jeeps, which I consider the magnum opus on the creation and development of Jeep. One Amazon reviewer has said, no better account of the creation of the Jeep has been written. Blatant, shameless plug right there, Joshua. Then
That's what we're here for.
I created a book called The Original Jeeps and Pictures, which is basically tells the story. The original Jeeps, we were discussing this before this show. It's a serious read. It's an investment if you're going to read the original Jeeps, okay? And it's not something you can read in a night. You have to read it over time because it's very detailed. There's a lot of technical information in it, so on and so forth. So I created another book called The Original Jeeps and Pictures, which tells the story in pictures that people can read in an hour and really get a sense of what happened. And if they want the detail, they can get the original Jeeps. My other book, which was my first book, I don't necessarily recommend too many people buying it because a lot of the material is in the original Jeeps and the original Jeeps and pictures. But the project management history of the first Jeep really focuses on the Bantam and the creation of the very first Jeep from a project management perspective. So if someone has an interest in something like that, it's a great book to have, and there's some information in that book that's not in the other two books. But if people ask me point blank, I'd say if you want the great history of the creation and development of Jeep by the original Jeeps and or the original Jeeps and picture, the original Jeeps is only $19.95. The original Jeeps and pictures is $9.95. So they're not expensive books, okay?
Yeah.
And they'll have the magnum opus on the creation and development of the Jeep that's ever been written. So there you
Yep.
go.
And are you on any social media where anyone could come and find you and check
Yeah,
out
we have a
anything?
website, originaljeeps.com, and we have a Facebook page, The Original Jeeps. So that's
All
kind of
right.
it. Amazon, originaljeeps.com, and The Original Jeeps Facebook page.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Paul. Just stand by one moment. Hey, everyone. Thanks for tuning in tonight and joining me and Paul in this conversation about the original Jeeps. Again, I really like Jeeps. I think they're awesome truck SUVs, whatever you want to call them nowadays. The duck thing has gone out of hand, but I think they're the most capable, awesome SUV out there, right? Or truck, or even better, the most capable quarter ton 4x4 light pickup truck out there, as they were originally slated to be called back in World War II. So again, thanks for joining us. Go check out all the socials. Go to Amazon, pick up the book, let them know, and when you see that Kickstarter for the movie, go support it. All right, we out.